Welcome to Charity Chat Canada, the podcast that explores charity issues in all the subsectors of the greater charity world. Our goal is to explore the issues facing this dynamic and thoughtful sector so that others in the greater kindness community can learn and help each other better tackle our common challenges. Charity Chat Canada is hosted by Adam Aptowitzer, a charity lawyer practicing out of Ottawa. To learn more about Adam and this podcast, please visit charitychat.ca. You can also find a link to Adam's latest book, A Legal Guide to Running a Charity in Canada.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Charity Chat, the corner of the internet that deals with all things related to charities in Canada. Of course, what we're trying to do is we're trying to learn a little bit more about the various subsectors and the issues that bind us all together. And one of the best ways of doing that is speaking with the people in the sector that really are deeply into the issues that affect the various niches. One of those people is Gena Rotstein. Gena is a philanthropy advisor with Common Sense. Common Sense, of course, is a social impact lab operating primarily out of Calgary. And it works with individuals from various generations to create social impact from financial events. And we're very, very pleased to have Gena with us today, who can help explain some of the cutting-edge issues that are affecting all of us, but which she is trying to solve for us. So, Gena, welcome.
Thanks, Adam, for having me.
Of course. Nice chatting with you. I was wondering if maybe you could give us a broad survey of the issues that you see affecting us or affecting the sector, and then maybe we could talk a little bit more about the specifics of those.
Sure thing. So my perspective of the sector and why I designed and built the company Common Sense with Richard Willett the way that we did was because we see the way that money flows into the sector as problematic. The model of philanthropy as it stands in North America is very much based on a please sir, can I have some more approach, where organizations go out and solicit funds, and as a result, we just keep funding problems and not financing solutions. So in working with the entrepreneurial families and the individuals that we work with, we're really looking about identifying ways to apply investment principles with philanthropic intentions to really drive meaningful social change. And so the problems that we see are really, how does money flow into the sector? Why is it flowing that way? And are there better ways for philanthropists to invest their capital, leverage it, and actually move the dial on whatever the issues are that they're interested in moving?
Well, that's fascinating. So, fundamentally, you see the idea that charities are out there asking for money as creating more problems than it solves. Is that right?
I think it's not so much that the way that they ask is creating more problems. I think the system is designed to prevent them from actually solving their problems. And there's certain charities that will always have to be in that space. I'm thinking of like church groups where tithing is just part of the culture. But if we really wanted to solve these problems, then we would have solved them already. We've institutionalized poverty by creating a food bank system and a shelter system, which really didn't exist the way it exists today until the early 80s. So there are certain segments of the charitable sector that were created as a result of the systems in which we had built our society. And so if we want to actually address some of these complex social problems, we need to stop looking at philanthropy as a handout approach, but really as an industry, and as such, we need to look at how money flows, how investment strategies are designed, how businesses are created, how charities operate. The whole system needs to be looked at differently. And so we start on the money side because it's easier to bring people to the table with a carrot than it is to bring people to the table with a stick.
But help me understand that. So, I have a friend. My friend Bob, has a family, and they lose their job. Bob and his wife lose their job in the mining town, and now they're in need of assistance. Um, would it not make perfect sense that now that they need assistance, they're asking for assistance, and in the same way, now that the charity has let's say a food bank has a client that it needs to service, that it goes and seeks the funds to help that client, as opposed to a situation where perhaps, I don't mean to cut you off, but as perhaps tell me what it is that you're suggesting would alleviate that problem.
So yeah, absolutely. This isn't a diss on Bob. This is how did we get to the point where we've gotten to where we have in Calgary 3 veterans food banks for 2,500 veterans. We have a food bank, again, a multi-million-dollar phenomenal institution that provides food to a whole bunch of different service agencies, including all of southern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan and southeastern BC. But how did we get to a point in our society where instead of actually creating community-based solutions, we've created institutionalized based solutions? So Bob lost his job because of a challenge in the market. Why weren't we teaching Bob proper financial literacy when Bob was in high school? How come we're going into the 5th generation of intergenerational poverty in Canada? There's so many systemic challenges that we have masked over with charitable solutions, not because we weren't wanting to do good. We need to have the charitable sector. But if we're actually really, really, really interested in solving these complex problems, we have to be honest about how we keep repeating the cycle. So there's a few things that are at play right now. One is we have a regendering of wealth, and this is going to fundamentally shift how money flows and the timeline it takes for money to flow into the charitable sector. And this is because women can take up to 3 years to make a major gift, whereas their male counterparts will take 6 to 8 months. And a major gift is $10,000 or more. And as women outlive men and start to control more and more of family household wealth and make their own wealth, that means there's going to be a lag time of donations into the charitable sector. What are charities doing to plan for a 3-year sales cycle on their major donors as opposed to a 6 to 8 month sales cycle? That's challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 that we're seeing is that the rising generation, so those who are in their right now 20s and 30s, and then the generation right below them who are being born today, are doing philanthropy differently. They're defining it differently, they're participating differently, and their expectations are different, down to what institutionalized giving looks like. So they might inherit a family foundation, but they might not fully understand why this is important. And as a result, we have over $1 billion of trapped capital in family foundations that are 3 generations or older. And that trapped capital is only going to stay trapped because you have a younger generation who doesn't actually engage in institutional philanthropy the same way. And then the third thing that's happening is because the younger generation doesn't engage in institutional philanthropy, like these formal structures of family foundations, they aren't creating and taking advantage of the tax incentives associated with high net worth younger individuals to set up their own foundations, which means, again, that money is flowing differently. And so it's not that these younger people are not generous. They are very generous. But what we call philanthropy in the current system is not recognized as philanthropy. It's not recognized as charity. They're going out and they're creating for-profit social purpose businesses. They're tapping into investment capital. They're tapping into debt financing. It's a totally different way of solving these complex problems and funding them. And so as a result, the charitable sector has a longer sales cycle with the regendering of wealth. It has a longer sales cycle because of the younger generation not engaging with their family foundations. And now it has a totally different competitive landscape because you have people creating for-profit businesses that are offering equity and financing to investors to solve the problems that institutional charities were created to solve to begin with. Layered on top of all this are governments that are pushing down what originally used to be government services into the charitable fabric and saying, hey, charities, you now have to take this on. And so that's why I'm saying the system is broken. That's why I'm saying that by working with the funding side or the financing side, we're able to actually map a different approach to driving social change and moving the dial.
Well, it sounds like there may be opportunity there, from what I'm understanding. So, and I understand your original point a little bit differently now too, and that being about my friend Bob and his circumstances. That being, of course, you're suggesting, well, there's always going to be a place for the institutions that have to act reactively to help people in what or benefit causes that arise, but that so much change can be better affected if done proactively. It's almost like you're suggesting a stitch in time saves nine. If we were perhaps better on teaching people financial literacy, or maybe job training and providing better programs, then we might have and better mental health programs. We might be needing organizations that provide for the poor in a bit less. So I understand that point. I think that certainly makes sense. But if you're taking it that way, then would not the fact that there's a gender the gender regendering, as you call it, of capital, and really implicit in that is what you're suggesting is the longer sales cycle. Wouldn't that then kind of help out? Because really it takes time to decide what kind of proactive attempts you want to make in terms of helping people and preparing programs necessary in a proactive way, much more than reactive. And you have to react quickly. With proactive, you have a bit of a benefit of making a plan and seeing it through for the long term. Do you not see any opportunities in what you described as problems?
I see huge opportunities. That's why they're called challenges, right? Because absolutely. But that also means that we have to encourage donors to be risk takers. So if we want organizations to start thinking big, they need to know that they have the security to take those risks. And too often funders will say silly things like, well, how much are you putting into fundraising and overhead? Instead of saying, what does it cost to not solve this problem? If we actually finance solutions and really focused on the problems at hand, the question of overhead and fundraising would be moot because they'd be giving the space to the organizations to actually do what you're suggesting, which is experiment, pivot, and scale up, scale back, and be honest about what's working and what isn't. But we've conditioned charities to say 100% of your donation is going to go to a project, which means that they're operating in the least effective model possible because they're operating on a shoestring. There's just so many inherent problems with that kind of financing model. It's not sustainable. It's not predictable. There's no guarantees. That's the issue at hand. But absolutely, I think that when we talk about being in the golden age of philanthropy, I fundamentally believe we are. I mean, there's an $8 trillion intergenerational wealth transfer happening right now. And that money can only go to one of three places, right? It's going to either go to taxes, it's going to go to the inheritors for their own investment and consumption, or it's going to go into the charitable sector. And if you look at the investment and consumption side, we're starting to see behavioral shifts there. We're looking at how people are investing their money in impact funds and taking and doing debt financing and all these different methods that an older generation, when they were looking at their own investment policies, were very traditional in. They weren't thinking about the social ROI in addition to the financial ROI. So there are a huge number of opportunities,
Oh, all right. Well,
which
then
is
let me ask you.
exciting.
Of course. But let me ask you this. And so, how do you recondition the charity world to, well, on the one hand, to think more proactively about the problems, and I guess on the second hand, to deal with this generational shift and gender shift that is going to change the method of their fundraising? Because obviously they go hand in hand.
Yeah, for sure. So we always work on the donor side. So the donors for us are at the center of the circle. And then what they want to, whatever their social vision is where we start. And then in our social impact lab, we convene conversations multi-sector, multi-industry. So for example, we're working on a project on youth mental health. And we spent 5 months interviewing pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, medical institutions, frontline charities dealing with youth mental health, the justice system, the immigrant system, everybody that touches youth mental health in some capacity. So at the end of the day, there were over 100 different organizations that were either interviewed or we did a document review on. And then out of that, we brought together the Alberta government, and then 3 frontline charities and our funder in the same room. And we said, okay, this is what we heard as lay people, not being experts in youth mental health. What are you hearing? And this was the first time that these agencies were brought together where their funding wasn't put in jeopardy, their charitable status wasn't being put in jeopardy, and they were able to have an open and honest conversation about where they see the gaps in the system. Because the system for youth mental health had been designed around the doctors and ensuring that taxpayer money was being used in the most efficient way possible, as opposed to the end user, who's the kid who is suffering from a mental health issue. And as soon as that group of individuals said, hold on a second, we have to put the kid at the center of the circle and not the taxpayer at the center of the circle, it created different space for conversation. So that's how we start to shift the dialogue. That's how we start to shift the way we do charities can do program design, but also how they engage their funders. Because now their funders aren't just seen as pocketbooks, but they're seen as additional experts. They're seen as people who can leverage their networks. They're seen as people who can actually provide their time, and they bring their pocketbook to the table. Too often charities look at their funders only as their treasures. They don't look at them with their time and their talent and their ties. And so it's really important for funders to know where they are in their funding life cycle and their business life cycle and their family life cycle, so that they can leverage those 4 T's, their time, talent, treasures, and ties, to really amplify where they want to go. And that for charities to understand that if they really want to move the dial, they have to get out of the mindset of failure is bad and operating capital is bad, and that they actually can talk about the real complexities of how you're going to solve youth mental health, or chronic homelessness, or pick an issue area and work your way backwards. But like, there are solutions to this, and at some point we're going to have to realize that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different results. And we've done it. We're in the 5th generation in Canada, and we haven't solved these problems. So let's do something differently.
Yeah, that's very profound. Well, it is. It is. I do a lot of reading of history, and you do see the same attitudes and same attempts at the same problems arising over and over again, and it's really a function of the fact that times may change, but human nature doesn't change, and so we back to that idea about a stitch in time saves nine. The reason for that saying that arose in the first place is because human nature was to wait until there was a rip before trying to stitch it back together. And I think what you're suggesting is, we don't have to do that. We can wait and see and evaluate, bring all the parties together, and see how is the rip happening and what can be done to fix that. But what you're saying is, to me, has an obvious truth to it. What I wonder is, there are certain subsectors of the charity area where it's easier to accomplish because there are often government groups, but other groups as well that can act as facilitators in bringing these parties together and perhaps give usually more well-funded organizations the opportunity to act proactively rather than reactively. But what do we do about sectors where there is no real umbrella group or strong single leader that can help refocus the vast amounts of money that are going into disparate groups? And I think of the fact that you pick any one area and you'll see competing charities that are created to raise funds, and sometimes from the same group of people, sometimes not, with competing solutions, and no discussion amongst them. So how do you really create that kind of discussion and facilitate it between the various groups, specifically in areas where there's no real government presence in delivering services?
The way that I hear this question is there are two pieces to it. One is sector oversight, and the other is government oversight. So from the sector side, and I'll draw your attention and your listeners' attention to the Calgary Chamber of Volunteer Organizations did an assessment of Alberta's nonprofit sector last year. And one of the things that came out of that report was that charities had expressed an interest in having support around the conversations regarding mergers and amalgamations, but that at the end of the day, they didn't feel safe, in quotation marks, having those discussions for fear of lack of funding or pulled funding. And so for all intents and purposes, they are disincented to actually have that discussion. And then on the government side, because there's no market pressures put on organizations or individuals who want to create charities, and basically as long as they can afford a lawyer and they can fill in the forms, you can have duplication in the sector because there's no market research that is pushed on that individual or that organization to check to see what the competitive landscape looks like. And so if we don't have pressures put on the market side, you can have duplication, and there's ego that drives those decisions, and storytelling, really good storytelling, which is part of the whole fundraising and marketing experience, that allows for organizations to be able to raise the funds that they need. And so the next piece of that question then, or the follow along to that question, is, well, what happens to those small grassroots organizations that are actually making differences, but they don't have those budgets to compete, or they were started with one issue in mind, and as things evolve, they've either grown or expanded because they needed to keep taking up market share, otherwise they would have been dissolved. And I think that that's part of the ego discussion that happens at the board. There are a lot of organizations in Canada that should have dissolved a long time ago, but because of the people sitting at the table at whatever time in their life cycle of that organization, they pivoted or expanded or shifted their mandate in an effort to stay alive. And at some point in time, we have to start questioning why we have the system that we have that allows for this stuff to happen. And it's the same thing on the funder side. There are a number of family foundations that are doing, not just family foundations, but donor advised funds and individual funders that are recreating the funding solutions to prop up organizations. And so, what would it look like if a group of funders actually came together and said, hey, we're all interested in moving the dial on food deserts across Canada? How do we collectively, instead of creating our own foundations to address food desertification, and what would it look like if we actually brought our resources together to just drive that solution home? So there's duplication on both sides. The challenge is that there's no market pressure on the supply side, so on the charity side, to actually desupply. And so at the end of the day, that, when charities say that they're hearing that their donors have donor fatigue, well, it's not just because charities keep asking, it's because there's so many charities that are asking for the same kind of stuff.
Wow, there's a lot there. But do you not? Well, there is. But do you not? But that's why we speak to experts, because they see the big picture. So, would it not have value then to suggest that these new charities bring something in the marketplace of ideas that can test out different products, particularly in light of your previous comment about the new generation coming in with a different set of priorities and a different way of giving and a different way of dealing with charitable problems? Would we not then want to encourage this idea that these people can come in and try out new methods?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly it. So, but that also means that funders have to be willing to let charities fail, and board members of charities have to empower their management and their team to fail, and we have to document the failure, and charities have to share it, and funders have to share what they invested in that didn't work. And they have to, and everybody has to make sure that they're not going to lose their charitable status for coloring outside the lines because they were trying to experiment on something. But we have this ridiculous model, and I know that I'm sounding passionate about it, but if we really want to solve these problems, then we have to get out of our own way. We've designed huge urban centers and didn't think about the fact that if you put a highway bisecting a community and the grocery store on one side and not on the other side, you're actually blocking people off from getting affordable, healthy food. Like, that doesn't take rocket science to figure out. You don't need a charity to solve that problem. But because we've created urban systems that are designed this way, we now have to have food banks and food trucks to get fresh food and produce at an affordable rate into these communities that have been cut off because of a highway design. We've got indigenous communities that don't have potable water. This isn't rocket science here. We shouldn't have to have private philanthropy solving potable water issues in Canada. But as a result of the way we've created the system, we have to do that. And so it now becomes incumbent upon the investor to start finding the best investable solution out there. And for some, it might be a charity, and for others, it might be a for-profit social business. But we have to get out of our own way to let these organizations test their models and fail or succeed and scale. And if these organizations are going to scale, we can't be angry at them when they say that they need to cover their overhead and their operating costs because they're scaling. Like, it's just, we talk on both sides of our mouth when it comes to traditional philanthropy, and it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, this is a very interesting discussion, and I guess implicit in what you're suggesting also, or maybe explicitly, is this idea that we need to share the information. It has to be the solutions tried in Halifax and failed in Halifax perhaps need to be shared with charities in Edmonton and Saskatoon and Victoria and elsewhere, so that they know what these ideas are. And especially because a lot of them are financed with what is effectively public dollars. So, there is this idea that the lessons learned should be shared so that everybody can benefit from the spending of these public dollars. It reminds me a little bit of the system they have for, which at least I understood they had for mining and oil exploration in Alberta, where the results of tests that were done would be filed with the government office, so that the newcomers that would come along didn't have to keep drilling and re-drilling the same plot of land, because everybody's looking for the same thing. If there was some way of sharing the lessons learned amongst the various participants and newcomers into the sector, then we might have a much more efficient spending of funds and a much more successful way of resolving social ills. Which is what I take out of what you're saying.
Yeah,
amongst
absolutely.
other things.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's not just incumbent upon the charities to share; it's incumbent upon the funders to share. We don't want to put the onus only on one half of the equation, right? So, and I also think that we can't just look at the charitable sector as a silo, because at the end of the day, the charitable sector is not just one thing, right? It's arts and culture, it's education, it's healthcare, it's sports and rec. I mean, it's poverty reduction, it's everything social welfare, right? So how do you compare an arts and culture organization with, a health trust? We have to be able to stop saying that here's the charitable sector and one organization speaks for the charitable sector, because it can't. There's too many industries inside that sector that have competing views, and complementary. I mean, if you give people access to green space, their mental health increases. If their mental health increases, then they have a decrease in draw on a universal healthcare system, which means that there is a loop there. There's a whole set of systems at play that, but because I want to say bifurcated, but it's trifurcated, I guess. I mean, we've broken the system up into so many different places and then basically put in rules that prevent them from talking to each other. I mean, that's why we do a social impact. That's why we run social impact labs. That's why we convene the conversations we convene. And we encourage and reward, in quotation marks, people to participate in these discussions. Because we're not out to design a product that needs to go and get fundraise dollars for. We're coming to the table with investors already at hand who are looking for ways to deploy their capital more effectively. And it means that people have to come to the table with a sense of curiosity and openness. And if they don't have the culture in their own organization to collaborate and be open and share failure, then they're not the right people that our clients are even going to want to invest in to begin with. So I think that's where the shift is going to happen. It's going to be a both and approach, where curiosity is one of the core tenets and values.
Well, I think that's a great place to end for now. This idea of resolving problems from every side, spoken from a person that burns the candle at both ends. So I think I think that's a great spot to stop. I think there's a lot of lessons there for people from every subsector of the charity world to really give some thought. And I certainly agree in your diagnosis from my little corner of the charity world. And hopefully these lessons will spread via this podcast and through discussions, and together we can work and find solutions. So Gena Rotstein, philanthropy advisor and philanthropy intuitor, if I can use that word. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Adam. It was a very interesting conversation.
Great. And for our listeners that are enjoying the show, if you have any ideas and you want to comment on the discussion today, please visit our website at www.charitychat.ca, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Charity Chat Canada. Please visit our website, charitychat.ca, where you'll find show notes, related articles and links, and details on how to contact us and where to find our episodes. Until next time.